Welcome to Avenue Vineyard Community Church online teachings. Our prayer is that you would learn and grow through listening about the teachings on Jesus and the Holy Bible. Please come visit us in the Crystal Kids Youth Center in Edmonton, Alberta. Our address is 8718 118th Avenue Northwest. You can also download our free app from our webpage, www.avenuevineyard.com, to help keep you connected to our church family. Donations, tithes, and offerings can be made through our app and on our webpage. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
So, as you can see, the title of the reflection this morning is, What is Freedom? And I want to explore this topic a little bit today, maybe throw out some, I'm hoping challenging considerations, but I'm hoping challenging in a good way. But to start off the morning, we are going to play a little bit of a game. And games are always kind of fun, or supposed to be fun. I don't know. Today, I want to play a what-if game. A lot of the thoughts and reflections I'm sharing, I'm not necessarily saying this is the way it is, but I am saying what if. What if the way that we are viewing things isn't really how they are? What if the way that we're seeing some of the craziness in the world really isn't how it really is? And I want to challenge us to really consider this, to be open. This is one of the ways that we can stop flopping around in the river and let God's Spirit, His current, carry us, is if we try and hold on loosely to some of the things that some of our own interpretations, and maybe let God reorient us. So some of these ideas that we're maybe really firmly hanging on to, all I'm saying is maybe just hold on to them a little less tightly this morning, offer them to God, and let's give the Holy Spirit a chance to speak. So I want to encourage you guys to try and dive into the game today, the reflection. What if the way that we are viewing things isn't really how they are? Now, this word freedom and the idea of freedom itself have been really popular in current events lately. There's probably, for me anyways, there was two big examples that came to mind pretty easily. One's been all over the news. I'm sure that you guys can probably think of this one too. One for me, the earlier one actually, was this controversy with Joe Rogan. And some of you might know who Joe Rogan is, some of you might not. He hosts a podcast on Spotify, and it is probably, I think it is, the most listened to podcast in the world. It gets like 20 million listens a week or something like that. I don't know. It's pretty huge. Anyhow, a number of people had issue with a couple of the interviews that he did with some of the guests and whatnot, and it raised this question of freedom of speech. And was it, now I'm having a brain fart. Was it Neil Young? Neil Young, music artist, basically said, either get Rogan off Spotify or take me off Spotify. And so Spotify booted Neil. So, and a number of other artists who were in disagreement said the same thing, like take us off or take him off. And so it became a controversial thing, and people weighing in on either side, is this really a right stance to take, freedom of speech, blah, 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 it became a bit of a thing. Now, the other example that probably comes to mind pretty easily for most of us is our own Canadian homegrown freedom convoy, which has blown up and become a big deal around the world. There's a number of protests, primarily in Ottawa, but there's also been smaller expressions in various parts of Canada. And this protest is making world news headlines. Other countries are watching. I saw somebody posted this, this was an American comment on some social media feed, but some American was like, wow, when Canadians are acting more like Americans than Americans. Because a protest, this sort of action confronting government like that is on the world stage, Canadians, we ride around on moose, we eat bacon, and we say sorry all the time, and we're good at hockey. But we don't ruffle any feathers. unless we're running out of maple syrup. So the fact that this freedom convoy's turned into a big thing, it's getting the world's attention. And part of the discussion is just various aspects of our freedom and what it looks like in practice. Now, I'm not going to preach a specific position here. I'm not going to get political. But what I want to attempt instead is to maybe challenge us to think critically in a good Jesus way. But before I start sharing some of my thoughts, I want to start with a little exercise. So this is your group exercise. I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes, and in groups of 2 to 3, maybe your family cohort, to the degree that you're comfortable, I'd like you to discuss some ideas surrounding freedom. You can use these 2 questions maybe to jumpstart your thoughts, your reflections. But how would you yourself personally define freedom? And what do you think freedom looks like in today's world, in this season, this COVID season that we find ourselves in, just the other stuff that's going on? What does freedom look like for you today in today's world? So I'm gonna give you 3 to 5 minutes to chat about that, and then we'll sort of regather. So feel free to pull your chair around, chat with someone, discuss away. Alrighty, if I can call you back in, get your attention here. What do you guys think? What were some of the big thoughts that you guys brought up, that you guys discussed? Anyone want to share your thoughts on freedom? Freedom to express your spiritual beliefs. Yeah. Freedom of religion. Freedom, the opposite of slavery. And I think that's a great one, Alex. Do whatever you want with no consequences. I do think that perspective is pretty prevalent. I think seeing freedom as the opposite of slavery, too, is a pretty deep one. Like, when we consider what is slavery, often, we don't want the consequences. Consequences, are a form of slavery. They're the things that bind us. But we want to do what we want to do, even if it binds us. Well, that's not really freedom now, is it? Freedom to make a choice. I am going to put you 2 on the spot. I know how opinionated you are at home, so... what was one of your guys' highlights? You guys talked about freedom of speech? Yeah, what that looks like, how it can be expressed. It's a complicated topic, it's one of those ones that is often so much more complicated than we maybe think it is. We just, we like to, hey, freedom of speech, and everyone gets behind freedom of speech, but do we really understand freedom of speech? And yeah, freedom, but do we really understand freedom? And are we really engaging in freedom? Or again, with the consequences that come, are we binding ourselves to something? Now, I was trying to think through this, and again, it's for me, it's a fun game to play. Maybe you'd like to play it too. But I was trying to think, okay, what would Jesus say if he walked in the door this morning, came up front, and we raised this topic with Jesus? What would he say today? And I think that he would probably tell us a really cool but confusing parable that none of us would understand. And then I think we'd ask him to explain it, and of course he would, and we probably still wouldn't get it. We'd bumble our way forward with our best understanding, and about 200 years later, other Christians who, 200 years later, they finally figured it out, they'd look back on us and they'd say, duh, I can't believe you guys didn't get it. But we didn't get it. Jesus would drop these profound truth bombs, and it was so counter to human experience of the world or the way that we saw things that it took a very long time for us to get his truth. So I think, Jesus, we really do need to ask for mercy and grace. Jesus, please give us a good, healthy, unselfish, helpful, healing, unifying discernment. And I really think that we need this, because too much of our recent human versions of supposed or proposed truth has been divisive. Which for me has been a really big red flag. It's been hard to discern a healthy way forward. Jesus said you'd know a tree by its fruit. Well, most of the fruit that is getting thrown at each other these days is divisive fruit. It's not life-giving fruit. It's condemning. It's pitting people against each other. It's dividing. It's bad fruit. So, I think there's something wrong here. Jesus prayed a pretty important prayer in John 17. And when we hear someone talk about the Lord's Prayer, we often automatically think about, how does the Lord's Prayer start? Our Father. You're all wrong. The Bible calls that the Lord's Prayer, but that's not really the Lord's Prayer. That was, the disciples said, hey, Jesus, teach us how to pray. And Jesus was teaching them how to pray. We'd be better off calling that the disciples' prayer. That was what Jesus was teaching the disciples to pray. John 17 records what I think might be more appropriately called the Lord's Prayer, because it's the whole chapter is Jesus praying. And Jesus is pouring out his heart to God on behalf of his current followers. And this is the real kicker. He prays for us. In that prayer, you read through it, and he prays for all that will come after, which is us. So John 17, Jesus is praying for you. That, I think, is the Lord's Prayer. The first disciples, and then us. And here is a portion of what Jesus prayed for us. Father, I have manifested who you really are, and I have revealed you to the men and women that you gave to me. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have fastened your word firmly to their hearts. And now at last they know that everything I have is a gift from you. And the very words that you gave to me to speak, I have passed on to them. They have received your words, and they carry them in their hearts. They are convinced that I have come from your presence, and they have fully believed that you sent me to represent you. So with deep love, I pray for my disciples. And I ask not only for these disciples, here he's praying for us, but also for all those who will one day believe in me through their message. I pray for them all to be joined together as one, even as you and I, Father, are joined together as one. I pray for them to become one with us so that the world will recognize that you sent me. For the very glory that you have given to me, I have given them so that they will be joined together as one and experience the same unity that we enjoy. You live fully in me, and now I live fully in them so that they will experience perfect unity. This was what was on Jesus' heart, was like us being united. And that the world would be convinced that, that God sent Jesus. Why? Because of the unity within his followers. For they will see that you love each one of them with the same passionate love that you have for me. That is the Lord's Prayer. This was Jesus' heart and his deep hope for us. Truth leading to life in him and unity amongst us. Now, when we look at the many voices in our culture right now, is that what we're seeing? And we might think, well, of course we're not going to see that from the political arena. They don't really, whatever. They're not speaking for Jesus. But what about the church? The church is a wider whole. All the voices that we hear coming out of the church, are they promoting unity? Or are they promoting division? Real truth, God's truth, Jesus' best truth for us in these days, I think it will unify us. So if we're not seeing unity, then I think our perceived truth might be lacking, and it might mean that we need to ask better questions and keep looking. So it's probably no surprise here to anyone that my favorite movies, I go on way too much, Lord of the Rings trilogy, I'm not really going to go there, but that I will let you know, this is a little bit of trivia, that hasn't always been the case. For about 6 years, I did have another favorite before the Lord of the Rings movies were released. So any guesses what was my previous favorite? Aha, we have a winner. Braveheart. And it took Rod all about half a second, so I guess I'm not transparent. But, Braveheart was released in 1995, and again, it was for 6 years, it was my favorite movie to the Lord of the Rings. When I first saw that movie, Braveheart, in theater, I was so moved. Like, that movie charged me up so much that I actually went back to the theater 2 more times in that same week to watch it again. In the opening week, as a poor student, I paid 3 times to watch that movie in the theater. And one of the most moving themes of that movie, Braveheart, surrounds this idea of freedom. For me, the most moving scene, it's right near the end where, if you remember the movie, if you've seen it, William Wallace has been captured by the English and he's being publicly tortured. His accusers are trying to get him to beg for mercy, torturing away. As soon as he says mercy, begs mercy from the crown, they'll stop torturing him. And just when they think they've beaten him, just when they think they've broken his spirit and he's going to cry mercy, instead, he cries out freedom. He gives this big bellowing call, freedom. And then they kill him. Freedom, something to die for. But maybe it's worth really considering how we view freedom and what is freedom. Is our idea of freedom or our version, this is the thing, the way that we view freedom, kind of like Alex shared, is it our version of the way that we individually think things should be? Don't infringe on my personal beliefs. I want to do what I want, regardless of the consequences. Is that freedom? Or do we see freedom the way that Jesus saw it and taught about it? Consider these passages. This is a great passage if you just want to take it out of context and make the Bible mean whatever you want it to mean. For the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Well, God's Spirit's everywhere, so we're free everywhere. We can just do whatever we want. But I kind of don't think that's what he had in mind. If we add it to this passage, freedom, yes, God's heart is for freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But tied to that, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And then all these things will be added to you. So, okay, well, we do get freedom. It's part of the deal. But seek his kingdom first. Seek his ways first. Make those things first, and we'll get freedom as part of the package deal. Okay, well, God's way, it's somehow tied in, related to freedom. And then Jesus says this in Mark. Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. Hold on, Jesus. What's up with that? Servant to everyone? That doesn't feel very free. This last one doesn't always or even often feel nice. Like, if I don't look out for me, God, what is my guarantee that anyone else is going to? How is that freedom? How does that lead me to freedom? That last passage can sometimes feel like a little bit of a bait and switch. Oh yeah, you're going to bless my life, Lord. You're going to lead me into goodness, and now you want me to be a servant to everyone? Small print, Jesus. Or is it? Jesus promises life to the full, and that the Holy Spirit will lead us into a life of freedom, and the way to it is to deny ourselves and to serve others. Serving others, putting them first, it doesn't seem very free. So what is freedom? I listened to an interesting podcast this week with a guy named Mark Sayers. He's a pastor and author from Australia. And his reflections for me triggered some really important thoughts. Things like, here's an idea for you, and let's just try and be open, but could the disruption of the last 2 years be more normal than what we were considering normal? Like, if you think of history, you think of world history from the known records of time up to the present, a snapshot of all of history, could the disruption of the last 2 years be more normal historically? In the years before COVID, were we living unrealistically? Are the people that are demanding freedom actually wanting freedom, or are they wanting to feel more comfortable with their own version of right and true? Are they grasping after a perceived security or knowing? What if, before COVID, we were kind of living in a dream world? A topic that has come up a lot as we progress through this pandemic has been this idea of normal. For the longest time, we wanted to get back to normal. Can't wait for things to go back to normal. And then it went on so long, and it's like, oh my gosh, we're going to be dealing with this for a long time. I don't know if we're going back to normal. We're going to have to go to a new normal. Now, we've been talking about, let's go back to this new normal, and what's this new normal going to look like? We want to return to normal, but here's the kicker. Maybe this will bend your noodle. What if what we are remembering as normal was actually abnormal? What if what we're remembering as normal wasn't normal at all? In many ways, the 2000s, this 20 years up until about 2019, in certain ways could be characterized by the belief that things are just going to get better and smoother and easier. More of the world's problems are going to be solved. We're going to have more convenience. Technology is going to make things more convenient, and we're going to have more and better individual choice at our fingertips. We got things like Uber and Skip the Dishes, transportation options and food on instant demand delivered to your door. You could visit any H&M outlet around the world, and you could find the exact same t-shirt located in the same store around the world. Personal preference at our fingertips, and self-driving cars were right around the corner. It was smooth to move around. We had relative economic stability, nothing that really affected us that much personally. For the most part, we could crack on the way that we wanted to, and with that came a perceived freedom. We could kind of do what we wanted, and life didn't hinder us. But consider world history. Consider where we are now. Maybe this is more like what world history is usually like. Periods of geopolitical tension, pandemics, economic upheaval. In history, that is normal. Maybe we bought into a myth that we could have this world that is really stable, and that we could live our best lives and go about our projects and live without disruption. Maybe the disruption that we've experienced in the big scope of things is actually more normal than what we've been considering normal. World history, life in the real world, seems to show us that disruption is normal. We want normal? Disruption is normal. Wars, famine, plagues, factions, the rise and fall of different empires over and over again. When I say that, does any of that sound new? Like, you've never heard of a war before? You've never lived through one in some other part of the world? There's always a war going on somewhere. Famine, plagues, different countries coming into power. This is not a new story. We see it over and over throughout history. And here's the crazy thing. It actually sounds like a lot of the story of the Bible. And just because some of these things may not have been very dominant in our own personal life experience up to this point, it doesn't mean that they're not normal. It got me reflecting again just on some of the chats I've had with my mom over this pandemic thing. My parents grew up in the generation immediately after World War II. Well, World War II was a pretty huge worldwide disruption. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was talking with my mom, and she was remembering being in grade school while they dealt with polio. That was kind of a big thing to have to deal with. And again, if we look at the bigger picture, now, hopefully you guys remember who Treebeard was. If you don't remember who Treebeard is, just think of something or someone extremely old. But if Treebeard was here with us today, being thousands of years old and having experienced thousands of years of history, would any of our current events seem not normal to him? Nope. It would just be how things have kind of always been. In recent history, especially since World War II, for many people, especially in the developed world, we've kind of in some ways been living a bit of an illusion. Things were kind of idyllic, kind of like living in a little bubble. We had the baby boom, and then the economic boom, and then the technology boom. We put a man on the moon, and then we put the world in our pockets. Thank you, iPhone. Things like this had never happened before. When we look at things in that context, maybe this destabilized world is really more normal than what we've been thinking of as normal. Destabilizing forces, world crisis in a complex world system, it begins to cascade and have knock-on effects. We're seeing political tensions and supply chain issues. You know, I heard about the supply chain issues, and 2 weeks ago I went to the local grocery store to buy treat snack for youth on the Wednesday night, and the chip aisle was pretty much empty. There weren't any chips. Like, oh my goodness, end of the world, forget toilet paper, there's no Doritos. You know, we're seeing cultural change. We're seeing economic change. And when we think about it, you know, this world was once dominated by the American economy, and we don't really realize being Canadian, being North American, it's Canadian, it's normal, it's whatever. We don't view it as American because it's pretty much the same here in Canada. I didn't really sort of get that perspective until I moved to Germany, and things there that I considered Canadian, everyone else saw as American. It made me so mad because, like, you'd want to go to the local diner or whatever, and the American diner. And it's like, it's not an American diner. You guys are German. It's a diner that's modeled after North America. No, it's an American diner. Why is it American? Well, because we called it American. Well, why'd you call it American? Because only Americans do it. And I was like, no, we have them in Canada too. By the way, everyone in the world, even though the Italians invented pizza, it's American pizza. Their idea is a pizza, it's American. Guess what? Americans get credit for ice cream too. Really kind of ticks me off. Even blue jeans. Americans invented blue jeans. Everything was American. But recently, there have been predictions that this world is shifting from that perspective. It's not an American centralized world anymore. There's been a shift of balance. The EU is having a much bigger influence in Europe, and China is having a huge influence in Asia. They're actually predicting that it's shifting from American-led to more of a three-center model. And with our technological advancements, they're preparing. There's talk of technological disruption. And this one, I think, for us, with all of our little personal devices, is going to be the hard one. They are forecasting that the internet, as we go forward, the internet is going to become a less smooth and more unpredictable place. Many countries and organizations are actually planning for and expecting cyber attacks that could shut down the entire country for days as they deal with stuff. And this isn't just science fiction. Like, remember that movie back in the 90s? I think it was called Outbreak, where they talked about, pandemics and viruses sweeping the world. Made a great movie. We're living through it today, in a sense. Disrupted internet, this isn't science fiction. Governments and organizations are planning for this. The internet is going to be disrupted. All this disruption. Maybe the times are changing, but maybe we're moving into a time that might actually better match world history than the last 80 years. Now, most of our experience has been in the last 80 years. Well, what if the last 80 years haven't been the best representation of normal? It kind of feels like we're in an in-between place. Some things are still the same, but many things seem to be changing. Maybe we're in a period of change with overlap. Think of Rome. Most of us, if we had to think of what most famous world power, Roman Empire. Okay, so what happened to the Roman Empire? They're not in charge anymore today. Well, it's not exactly like Rome ended on a Tuesday and then the Dark Ages started on Wednesday. It didn't happen like that. There was overlap. There was a transition. And maybe that is some of what we're experiencing. But when things are uncertain, we often have a tendency to default to extremes. We want everything to go back to the way that we're comfortable with, the way that we think it should be. Yeah, the Romans, when things started to crumble, they blamed it on the Christians. These blinking Christians. They introduced this new God, and now life as we knew it is falling apart. I know, we need to go back to normal. Let's go back to the old gods. That will solve our problem. It didn't solve their problem because that wasn't the problem. You know, we want to go back to what we saw as freedom when things were going the way that we wanted them to go. But then we can flip to the other extreme. The world is ending. We're on the verge of a zombie apocalypse, The Walking Dead, and conspiracy theories. You know, on a side note here, I will say that this is why all of you should take up archery, because you can use the same arrows over and over again to shoot zombies, okay? Bullets are kind of one and done. So once you're out of bullets, you're out of bullets. But arrows you can use over and over again. So anyhow. But maybe more realistic is not the extreme, you know, wanting to be in control, going back to what we thought was normal, or the world is ending, but maybe it's something more in the middle. Maybe we're moving away from a predictable, secure, stable world where we don't have to think about what's happening outside of us or outside of the church, and we can just get on with our own thing. You know, maybe we're moving into a season of more disruption as we change, as the world changes. Maybe we've lost some predictability. Maybe we're entering a season of more instability. If we're honest, I think reality has a way of revealing our weaknesses and in certain ways kicking our butts. Maybe we're returning to reality, a reality where conflict is normal. We're not in power the way that we thought we were, which means that we need to be way more dependent. And I think that this brings us to a big question: dependency. Is this a bad thing? Again, in the developed world and in our culture, in a lot of ways, we think it is. We want to be free and independent and have our say and do our own thing without anybody else interrupting us or stepping on our toes. But when things are uncertain and when things are unpredictable, when things are not stable, maybe we have no choice but to be more dependent. But is that bad? We need to be, you know, who are we supposed to be dependent on? Well, I'd say we're supposed to be more dependent on each other. Other people for sure, which is why, you know, I think that was part of Jesus' great idea behind the church. Hey, let's build this community of people that are, you know, committed to me and following me, that they're not blood relations, but they'll basically act like it. They'll become a new family that can love and support and build one another up. They can be dependent on each other. And growing dependency on God. It's this, you know, the uncertainty is an opportunity to grow more dependent on God. Now, think of that. If you could be more dependent on God and that was just more of your daily life, is that good or bad for us? I think if we're honest, it kind of feels bad because, Jesus, that means that I can't just do what I want. But if I'm dependent on you and my life is more entwined with your life, oh gosh, I guess that really is kind of a good thing. Consider the Bible story, you know, the story of the Israelites. Consider the story of King David going from, you know, this lowly shepherd boy to leader and eventually the king of the nation. Or consider Jesus himself. They all had a season of living in an uncertain, unpredictable wilderness, a time of transition where they were forced to live in total dependence on God. In the wilderness, they learned dependence on God. They learned to trust God. They learned not to lean on their own understanding. How many of us need to learn that lesson? Consider Israel after God rescues them from slavery. We talked about how freedom being the opposite of slavery, freedom delivering us from slavery. Well, consider the Israelites after God rescues them from slavery. Where do they end up? They end up out in the wilderness. They have this wilderness experience. And do you remember how they responded? Oh, Lord, this sucks. We want normal. We want to go back to normal, Lord. Let us go back to Egypt. Really? This wilderness, this freedom thing, Jesus, isn't all it's cracked up to be. Let's go back to slavery. That's what the Israelites said. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back to captivity. Why? Because it was predictable in that there was and in that predictability, they were used to it. For them, their slavery had become normal. And so even though they were slaves, because it was predictable and they knew what to expect, they had a measure of security. They might have been slaves, but they knew where their next meal was coming from. They knew they might not get one, but they knew eventually, and they knew where. They knew where they would sleep that night. It might be a patch of grass next to the slave pit they're working in, but they knew where they would sleep. There was a measure of security. God took them out of that. He took them out of slavery to journey into freedom, and he takes them to the wilderness, the in-between, the unpredictable, so that they could relearn trust, so that they could relearn what dependence on him really meant. Maybe we need this lesson too. Giving up a sense of control, embracing the unpredictable, learning trust and learning dependency, it was their path to true freedom. The way to get to freedom was to walk through the unknown, the unpredictable, and to learn those lessons of dependency. Maybe losing our sense of control and embracing an unpredictable wilderness season is our best path towards a fuller expression of freedom. Maybe, just maybe, the longing to go back to normal is in some ways not a longing for freedom, but instead a longing to go back to a form of slavery, a cultural form of slavery of self-will. I think each of us needs to have a heart-to-heart with God and consider how uncertainty, learning trust and dependence might really be an invitation to freedom. In many ways, I think we've been culturally conditioned that if something feels bad, then something must be wrong. Is that true? Or is it an invitation to trust God in a deeper way? Maybe this is a season where God is pushing us deeper and deeper into dependency on him. Throughout the history of humankind on this planet, human beings have never been in control of nature or the natural world. When there was an earthquake, we just had to deal with it. A drought, persevere. Fires, get out of the way and rebuild. But for many years, we have been trying to create a world where we have no difficult periods. We live in climate-controlled, safe environments with an illusion that we could protect ourselves from anything. What we're getting through the pandemic is a taste of nature. We're not in control. Disruption. Maybe we need to adopt a biblical wilderness mentality and learn what it means to lean into God, to really trust in God, to daily depend on God and not our own understanding or the understanding of the popular media, especially since so much of it has been fueled by fear. So to wrap things up this morning, I just want to go back to our little exercise. You guys had some good discussion on freedom beforehand. Maybe some of these thoughts have sparked some ideas for you, but I want to invite you guys to, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same people, it can be, but go back to your groups and talk again. I'm going to throw it up there again. Reconsidering how would you define freedom? And what do you really think it looks like for us in today's world? I'll give you another couple minutes for that, and then I'll pray to close, and we can go back to visiting or praying for one another. So again, just to discuss this idea again, you got a few minutes, go. Alrighty. So there will be opportunity here. If you want to keep carrying on with your conversations, you'll have that chance in just a minute. But just before we wrap up, did anyone want to share your deep thought? I'm with you, Jackson. Yeah, when you consider the bulk of world history, I think, and not all, but when you think of some of the most free outward expressions of freedom in all of Christian history, there's one group that I think has done the absolute best job of putting that on display. And that is the Martyrs. How many stories of people singing hymns and worship to God as they burn to death or as they're about to be executed because they have this inner freedom that nothing in this world can put them in slavery or bind them up. They had that connection with Jesus, that freedom in Jesus, that there was no fear of death. Well, if you're not afraid of death, what are you afraid of? And if you're not afraid of anything, aren't you free? So I do think that a life of freedom and this promise of freedom is part of the life that Jesus offers us. But I do think that we maybe need to recalibrate and come back to Jesus and realize that in too many ways we've bought into the cultural packaging of what freedom is supposed to look like. And like Jackson said, God's kingdom is upside down and counter to pretty much every way that the culture tries to point us, the direction it points us. So, anyhow, some thoughts. I'll leave you guys with that and, continue to share, reflect on that as we hang out after the service here. I'll just finish with prayer. Jesus, your kingdom really is an upside down kingdom, Lord, and your ways are not our ways. But your ways, Lord, when we can see them, when we can embrace them, your ways really do lead us into freedom. That it doesn't make sense to the world. They think it looks silly, but your ways lead us to true life and lead us to true freedom. And Lord, we really need to press into you. We need to relearn deeper dependency on you. We need to relearn deeper trust in you. And Lord, as we do that, we need to be a safe people that can depend on and lean on one another at the same time. Jesus, you are our strength. You are our anchor. You and your kingdom are our foundation. I do pray, Lord, that you would, just grace us with a fresh vision and understanding of that as we go forward. We don't have to be afraid, Jesus, of what's to come because we're going forward with you, and in you is life and freedom. Holy Spirit, lead us into that truth. In Jesus' name, amen.